Lesson 5. Cutting. In this lesson, we will talk about the concept of cutting. First, let's understand a concept known as the number of groups of stones. Let's first define exactly what a group of stones is. When counting groups, it usually refers to stones of the same color placed on the game board, where the stones are connected hand in hand. We would then refer to these stones as a single group. For example, when a black stone is placed on the board, we say this is one stone, but actually it can also be called a group. Okay, a white stone placed on the board is also one stone and can also be called a group. Next, black continues to play. Okay, black plays here, and white also plays here. Now, because these black stones are connected hand in hand, these two black stones are called a single group, and these two white stones are also a group. Next, black plays over here, white plays over here, and black plays right here. So how many groups of stones are on the board now? According to our previous definition, stones must be connected hand in hand. We can see that these three black stones and this single stone have not formed a connection. Similarly, these two white stones and this single stone have not formed a connection either. So now there are four groups of stones on the board. That is why we first learn this concept of the number of groups. In this shape, the concept of cutting that we are going to learn has actually already appeared. Black plays here and white plays here. This move is called a cut. Let's take a look at the definition of a cut. A cut can also be referred to as severing, which means placing a stone to separate the opponent's unconnected stones, causing them to lose their connection. The purpose of cutting is usually to make the opponent's stones weaker, thereby gaining an advantage in fighting or attacking. We generally divide the methods of cutting into two main categories. One is called a diagonal cut, and the other is called a straight cut. The shape that we are looking at right now is an example of a diagonal cut. Next, let's first take a look at the characteristics of a diagonal cut. It is safe to say that the diagonal cut is the most common type of cut we encounter. Or we can define it as a cut in the strict sense. Because what we usually consider a cut must first have a cutting point. What exactly is a cutting point? A cutting point in a shape looks just like this. It usually refers to the intersection between two adjacent groups of stones that are not yet fully connected. If the opponent plays on this intersection, it will form a cut, and this specific intersection is called a cutting point. Let's look at this shape, these two white stones, and this single white stone have not yet formed a connection. Therefore, the position of this intersection is called a cutting point. And when black plays at this position, it is called a diagonal cut. We can pay attention to the shape of the diagonal cut. Its shape at the position of these four stones will definitely be a mutually cutting shape. That is to say, we can tell from the shape whether it is a diagonal cut, as one of its main characteristics is mutual cutting. When black cuts here to separate the white stones, if we look at it from another angle, white has also cut the black stones. So, as long as you see a shape like this, where both sides cut each other, then it is a diagonal cut. Now let's take a look at what a straight cut is. This shape here is the most standard example of a straight cut. We can see that in this shape, the cutting point we just mentioned, or a cutting point in the strict sense, does not exist. This position has the dual function of cutting the opponent and connecting your own stones. However, this position is not the same as the cutting point in the shape that we discussed in the strict sense. When black connects right here, it cuts the white stones, and while cutting white, its own stones remain connected. We refer to this specific kind of cut as a straight cut. We can understand it this way. A diagonal cut is always a mutual cut, while a straight cut often means cutting the opponent's stones while keeping your own stones connected. Let's set up another shape on the board to review the two cutting shapes we just discussed. For example, let's take a look at a shape exactly like this. So now, if black plays right here to cut the white stones, it is called a straight cut, because it does not present the shape of a diagonal cut. That is the first reason. Secondly, we can clearly see that when black plays here, it forms a hand-in-hand connection with this stone. It cuts white while keeping its own stones connected. This kind of cut is called a straight cut. Then, for the next move, if white plays right here, this move becomes a diagonal cut. Because a cutting point in the strict sense appears right here, and cutting here forms a mutually cutting shape. This is exactly a standard diagonal cut. Regarding cuts, the biggest difference between a straight cut and a diagonal cut is that a diagonal cut is always a mutual cut. Through this cross-cut shape, you can clearly see it is a diagonal cut. However, the shape of a straight cut is not limited to a specific shape and might not even have a cutting point in the strict sense, just like this shape. It cuts the opponent while its own stones remain safely connected. Finally, let's take a look at a rather unique shape. We can see this position in the middle. Strictly speaking, it cannot be called a cutting point, but it actually serves the function of cutting. When black plays right here, we see that black forms a connection and cuts the white stones. Conversely, when white plays right here, white forms a connection and cuts the black stones. So, can we really call this position a cutting point? At most, in certain situations, it can be called a cutting point in a broad sense. It acts as a cutting point, but it is a shape without a true cutting point. Therefore, we call all such types of cuts straight cuts. To learn to identify them, the most important difference is that a diagonal cut separates the opponent, while your own stones are also being separated. So it is a mutually cutting type of shape. On the other hand, a straight cut is relatively safe because your own stones remain safely connected. Therefore, a straight cut is often much more severe than a diagonal cut. Alright, that is all for today's lesson.